When I get the black claw on that big head of yours, you're going down on your knees begging for mercy.
Lanza coming down to that knee across the chest. And as you say, he steadily softens his man up, steadily weakens him, catches him, and now puts that claw on. And when he comes across both temples like that, tremendous pressure.
Blackjack Lanza. Maybe not a household name like some of the WWF guys, right? But trust me, if you have ever watched wrestling in the late 70s and 80s, then I bet you knew this guy. Lanza was a man who wasn't flipping around, doing fancy moves, or putting on a show. No, none of that. He was an I'm here to fight dude who managed to hypnotize the audience with his I don't give one flying damn attitude. I'm sure the women will get me. A mysterious man who talks less and does more of working. This was Lanza's appeal. Hot, jacked, raw, and totally cowboyish.
I'll tell you one thing. Mulligan and Lanza act as one person. You have the Blackjacks, Lanza, Mulligan, Mulligan, Lanza. We're the biggest tag team in the entire world.
You heard him, right? He's only ever the best in the world, nothing less. But did the wrestling world believe that too? Hold your horses, because this video is all about it and some mind-blowing controversies that really made Lanza the talk of the wrestling town. But before we go into any of that, let's start from the start. Born on October 14th, 1935, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, our boy had a pretty normal start, attending the University of Minnesota and working as a sociology teacher. But something about wrestling called to him. He had to go, he really did. So man traded textbooks for turnbuckles and ran to the first person he could think of, Verne Gagne. Verne Gagne took him in and trained him like a madman, very soon making him step into the ring in 1961 under the name Joe Lanza. Lanza wrestled in NWA Mid-America and quickly proved he had what it took to hang with the best. The rest is history. Now let's come to the part you've clicked on this video for. Lanza was a gritty and hard competitor who made everything look real, sometimes a little too real. That's what people still talk about, and this is his first controversy. If you ever got to see him wrestle against guys like Dominic DeNucci or Victor Rivera, you'd get it right away. Seriously, I found some old footage. Check it out. You can practically hear the smack of his moves.
Covers his ears. The minute he takes his hands down, the crowd starts in again. In the meantime, there is action in the ring between Blackjack Lanza and Ricky Martel. Side headlock into the rope, shoulder. Down goes Lanza. A jump, the flying drop kick as Martel comes to life. And an arm drag takedown. I don't know what happened there, but all of a sudden, Blackjack Lanza able to turn the table.
Everything he did looked like it hurt, and guess what? It did. Poor Rick. These days, wrestlers talk about guys who were stiff in the ring. Well, Blackjack Lanza? Definitely stiff. He wasn't just for show. His punches, kicks, slams, they landed with real force. He blurred that line between wrestling and a real fight, for sure, and wrestlers hated him for it. But on the flip side, the fans ate it up, especially the hardcore fans back in the 70s and 80s. His matches, whether he was wrestling by himself or teaming with Mulligan against teams like the High Flyers, were believable and exciting because of that realness. Just raw intensity. Now, speaking of intensity, the funny thing is, you don't really hear stories about backstage brawls with Blackjack Lanza. Why? Because people knew better than to mess with him. He just radiated, don't even try it, and people got it. But even after all this, he wasn't a household name. Jack Lanza had been in the business long enough to know that sometimes all it takes is the right moment, the right pairing, to turn a career from steady to legendary. For him, that moment came when Bobby Heenan introduced him to Mulligan. Lanza had built a name for himself as a solid hand in the ring, but something was missing. He wasn't the headliner. He wasn't the guy people whispered about in hushed tones, and he clearly wasn't the next big thing. That changed the day the Blackjacks were born in 1971. Mulligan and Lanza, two men cut from the same cloth, rough around the edges, built for the fight. The first time they stood together, dressed in black, hats pulled low. They knew this was going to be big. It got really big, but not for Lanza. Mulligan took all the limelight, and our poor boy just became a plain old tag team partner. This also has a lot to do with him switching to AWA and then neglecting WWF altogether. And that brings up an interesting question. Could Lanza have been a bigger star if he had fully embraced the WWF? He had the look, the skills, and the toughness to be a main eventer. But for whatever reason, that never quite happened. Maybe it was because WWF was looking for something different at the time, with more focus on characters and entertainment than on pure wrestling. Either way, Lanza couldn't be a big wrestling name, and I, as a fan, am really sad about that. One reason for this was his partnership with Blackjack Mulligan. Together, they formed the Blackjacks, a tough and successful tag team that won championships and left a lasting impact on wrestling. But being part of such a strong duo had its challenges. People couldn't help but compare them. Mulligan had a big personality, a deep, booming voice, and a look that made him stand out. He naturally grabbed attention. Lanza, on the other hand, was just as tough and skilled, but didn't demand the spotlight in the same way. Because of this, Mulligan became the better-known name. When fans talked about the Blackjacks, Mulligan was usually mentioned first. This happens a lot in wrestling. In many tag teams, one wrestler ends up being the star, while the other stays in the background. Lanza often found himself in that situation. He was quieter and more serious about his work, while Mulligan enjoyed playing a larger-than-life character. Even though Lanza was crucial to the team's success, he didn't always get the same level of credit. Even after retiring from the ring, Lanza still faced the same comparisons. When people looked back on the Blackjacks, Mulligan was often the one who got the most praise. But that wasn't entirely fair. Lanza played just as big a role in their success. Unfortunately, in wrestling, the biggest personalities tend to get the most attention, and Lanza's reserved nature meant he was sometimes overlooked. Sadly, he passed away in 2021 at the fine age of 86. Even though he wasn't a massive WWF star, Lanza stayed involved in wrestling. He took on a backstage role as an agent in WWE, where he helped younger wrestlers improve their matches and made sure everything ran smoothly. This job isn't as glamorous as performing in the ring, but it's just as important. WWE wouldn't have put him in that role if they didn't respect his knowledge and experience. People might argue about Lanza's career choices or whether he should have been a bigger name, but one thing isn't up for debate. He was highly respected in the wrestling world. He was known for his toughness, skill, and dedication, both as a wrestler and behind the scenes. While he may not be as famous as some of the all-time greats, those who truly understand wrestling history know how important he was. In wrestling, respect means everything, and Lanza earned plenty of it. His legacy may not be as loud as some others, but it's just as strong. He was a true professional, a skilled wrestler, and a key figure in the sport, and that's something that will always matter. What also matters is his legacy, and what do you expect from a fan like me? I will not rest until every wrestling fan visits this documentary and feels nostalgic about how great Lanza was. So for the real wrestling fans, here is a quick rundown of his career, from his early days to his peak moments, and finally the end of it all. Growing up in the Midwest, young John was surrounded by a world where hard work and toughness were part of everyday life. Winters were brutal and people were built strong. It was the kind of environment that shaped him into the tough, no-nonsense man he would later become in the wrestling ring. As a kid, Lanza was always active. He loved sports and competition, and like many boys at the time, he admired strong athletes. Football was a big part of his life, and he played throughout his school years. He was naturally athletic, which made him stand out among his peers. But even as he played football, something else was catching his attention: professional wrestling. Back in the 1950s, wrestling was growing in popularity across America. The matches were exciting, the wrestlers were larger-than-life characters, and the crowds loved the drama of it all. Lanza, like many kids, was fascinated by the sport. He enjoyed watching the tough men battle it out in the ring, and deep down, he wanted to be one of them. After finishing high school, Lanza went on to study at the University of Minnesota, where he continued playing football. He was strong, quick, and had the kind of presence that made people take notice. But while college football was exciting, He wasn't completely sold on it as a career. His heart was still set on wrestling. Every wrestler has a moment where their career truly begins, and for Lanza, that moment came when he met Verne Gagne. Gagne was a highly respected wrestler and trainer who had a reputation for turning young athletes into stars. When Lanza expressed his interest in professional wrestling, Gagne saw potential in him. Training under Gagne wasn't easy. He was known for pushing his students hard, making sure they were physically and mentally prepared for the demanding world of wrestling. Lanza spent long hours learning the fundamentals: grappling, holds, takedowns, and ring psychology. He trained alongside other hopeful wrestlers, many of whom would go on to have successful careers themselves. At first, Lanza wrestled under his real name, competing in small regional promotions. The matches were tough, but he quickly gained a reputation for being a strong and aggressive competitor. He had the size, the skill, and most importantly, the attitude that made him stand out in the ring. As John Lanza started wrestling, he realized he needed something to make him stand out. He was strong and skilled, but in the world of wrestling, having a unique character was just as important. That's when he became Blackjack Lanza. He took on a cowboy-like image, wearing black trunks and a black cowboy hat. His new name, Blackjack, made him sound tough and dangerous, which fit his wrestling style perfectly. Inside the ring, he was aggressive and intimidating, always ready to take down his opponents. Fans quickly noticed him. Some cheered, while others booed, but everyone paid attention. His new look and attitude helped him climb the ranks in wrestling, making him a well-known name in the sport. This was the beginning of his journey as a feared and respected wrestler. Blackjack Lanza's career reached new heights when he teamed up with Bobby the Brain Heenan. Heenan was one of the smartest and most cunning managers in wrestling. He knew how to guide wrestlers to success, using his quick thinking and sneaky tactics to give them an advantage. With Heenan by his side, Lanza became even more dangerous. He was already a strong and skilled wrestler, but Heenan helped him become a true star. Lanza and Heenan worked together in the American Wrestling Association, one of the biggest wrestling promotions at the time. Wrestling was very different back then, with different regions having their own top wrestlers and championships. Lanza quickly became one of the most feared wrestlers in the AWA. Fans either loved him or hated him, but everyone paid attention when he was in the ring. He played the role of the villain perfectly, using aggressive moves, bending the rules, and making sure the audience was always reacting to what he did. Lanza's career changed again when he teamed up with another tough wrestler, Blackjack Mulligan. Together, they became known as the Blackjacks. Mulligan and Lanza were a perfect match. Both were big, strong, and intimidating, and they had a cowboy-style look that made them stand out. Dressed in black and sporting thick mustaches, they looked like they had just walked out of a Western movie. They used their size and power to dominate opponents, quickly becoming one of the most feared tag teams in wrestling. The Blackjacks wrestled in different wrestling promotions, but one of their biggest achievements came in 1975 when they won the WWF World Tag Team Championship. The WWF was the most famous wrestling company in the world, and winning the tag team titles meant they were considered the best team in the company at the time. Their matches were exciting and unpredictable. They used a mix of brute force and clever tricks to win, often working together to take down opponents in ways the referee couldn't see. Fans knew that when the Blackjacks were in the ring, chaos was sure to follow. During their time together, the Blackjacks had some incredible rivalries. One of their toughest battles was against the Crusher and Dick the Bruiser, two legendary wrestlers known for their toughness and brawling style. Their matches were intense, with both teams refusing to back down. They also faced the Valiant brothers, Jimmy and Johnny, who were a flashy and skilled team with a completely different style. The matches between these teams were thrilling, as the Blackjacks relied on brute strength while the Valiant brothers used speed and teamwork. Another memorable feud was against Chief Jay Strongbow and Billy White Wolf, two wrestlers who were extremely popular with fans. The Blackjacks, as villains, played their role perfectly, frustrating fans by using every trick they could to stay ahead. Lanza's wrestling style made him stand out. He wasn't just big and powerful, he was smart in the ring. One of his most famous moves was the claw hold, where he grabbed an opponent's head and squeezed with incredible force. It became his signature move, and once he locked it in, it was almost impossible to escape. His matches were always exciting because he knew how to control the pace, when to show strength, and when to outthink his opponent. He used just the right mix of power, strategy, and intimidation to win. One of the things that made the Blackjacks special was that they weren't just successful in one place. They won championships in multiple wrestling promotions, including AWA, NWA, and WWF. Back in those days, wrestling wasn't dominated by just one company. Instead, it was made up of different territories, each with its own champions and stars. Traveling from one territory to another and still being successful proved that Lanza and Mulligan were truly great wrestlers. Lanza also had success as a singles wrestler. While he was best known as part of the Blackjacks, he also won individual championships, like the NWA Georgia Heavyweight Championship and the NWA American Heavyweight Championship. This showed that he wasn't just good in a tag team, he could also dominate on his own. Throughout the 1970s, Blackjack Lanza was one of the biggest names in professional wrestling. Whether competing alone or alongside Blackjack Mulligan, he was a top star. He won championships, main evented big matches, and built a reputation as one of the toughest wrestlers in the business. Even those who didn't like his villainous ways had to admit that he was one of the best. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Lanza's career was still going strong. He had already accomplished so much, proving himself as one of the most respected and feared wrestlers of his time. He had made a lasting impact in the wrestling world, and his influence was clear in every match he fought. He had played the role of the villain so well that fans never forgot him. His time at the top of the wrestling world had been filled with incredible matches, great rivalries, and championship victories that cemented his legacy. His journey wasn't over yet, but he had already reached the peak of his career. His name was now written in wrestling history, and his success as both a singles and tag team competitor had made him one of the most unforgettable wrestlers of his generation. Lanza's wrestling career had been full of exciting matches, big victories, and tough battles. He had spent years as one of the most feared and respected wrestlers in the business. But as time went on, things started to change. Wrestling was a tough world, and no matter how great a wrestler was, they couldn't stay at the top forever. New wrestlers were coming in, younger and faster, and they were the ones getting the big opportunities. Lanza was still tough, still skilled, but his best years in the ring were behind him. The 1980s were a time of change in wrestling. The sport was growing bigger than ever, and television was playing a huge role in making wrestlers into superstars. Fans started seeing new faces in the ring, and the old legends slowly started stepping away. Lanza knew that his time as an active competitor was coming to an end. He wasn't wrestling as often, and the spotlight wasn't on him anymore. It was hard for any wrestler to step away from the ring, but Lanza accepted that his time had passed. He had accomplished so much, and he had nothing left to prove. Even though he wasn't wrestling full-time anymore, Lanza didn't completely walk away from the business. Wrestling had been his life for so many years, and he still had a deep love for it. Instead of competing, he took on a different role behind the scenes. He worked as an agent and mentor for younger wrestlers, helping them learn the ropes and guiding them in their careers. Lanza had spent years inside the ring, and he knew the business inside and out. He had learned from the best and had been in some of the biggest matches in wrestling history. Now he wanted to share that knowledge with the next generation. Many young wrestlers respected Lanza and listened carefully to his advice. He helped them understand how to tell a story in the ring, how to connect with the audience, and how to handle themselves as professionals. He was tough but fair, always wanting the best for those he worked with. He wasn't interested in being in the spotlight anymore, but he still had a major influence on the sport. But despite everything he had done, Lanza didn't always get the recognition he deserved. Many wrestling legends were celebrated and talked about all the time, but Lanza's name wasn't mentioned as often. He had been one of the toughest and most skilled wrestlers of his time, but he wasn't always given credit for how much he had contributed to the business. Some fans remembered him well, especially those who had watched him in the 1960s and 70s, but newer fans didn't know as much about him. He wasn't always included in lists of the greatest wrestlers, even though he had played a major role in shaping the industry. Years passed, and Lanza continued working quietly behind the scenes. He had given everything to wrestling, and he didn't feel the need to chase fame or recognition. He had always been a no-nonsense, hard-working wrestler, and he carried that same attitude into his later years. He wasn't the type to go on interviews bragging about his past or trying to remind people of his accomplishments. He simply did his job and remained a respected figure among those who truly knew the business. Finally, in 2006, Lanza received an honor that had been a long time coming. The Blackjacks were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. It was a moment of recognition that many fans felt should have happened much earlier. Lanza and his tag team partner, Blackjack Mulligan, were finally given the respect they deserved as one of the greatest tag teams in wrestling history. The ceremony was a special moment, with wrestlers and fans celebrating their legacy. Even though this was an important honor, Lanza still didn't try to step back into the public eye. He continued to live a quiet life, staying connected to wrestling but never seeking attention. He had played his role, left his mark on the industry, and was content knowing that those who truly knew wrestling understood his impact. As Lanza got older, he started to stay out of the wrestling business completely. The sport had changed so much since his time in the ring, and he was happy to watch from a distance. He had spent decades traveling, wrestling in front of thousands of fans, and living the tough life of a professional wrestler. Now he simply wanted peace. On December 8, 2021, Blackjack Lanza passed away at the age of 86. His death was met with sadness from those who had known him and worked with him. Many wrestlers, including some of the biggest names in the business, shared their memories of him. Vince McMahon, the owner of WWE, spoke highly of him, calling him a man's man and recognizing his contributions to the sport. Those who had been lucky enough to work with him knew how much he had given to wrestling. For fans who had watched him wrestle in his prime, the news of his passing was a reminder of just how great he had been. They remembered his fierce style, his intimidating presence, and the way he had entertained them every time he stepped into the ring. Even though he was gone, his matches, his rivalries, and his influence on younger wrestlers would always be part of wrestling history. Blackjack Lanza was a wrestler from a different era, a time when wrestling was tougher and more brutal. He had played the role of the villain perfectly, making fans boo and cheer at the same time. He had won championships, headlined major events, and helped shape the future of the industry. Even though he didn't always get the recognition he deserved, those who truly knew wrestling never forgot him. He was one of the toughest, most skilled wrestlers of his time. He had been a star in his era, a mentor to younger wrestlers, and a respected figure in the industry. His journey from a young wrestler trying to make a name for himself to a legendary figure in wrestling was something special. He had played his part, given everything he had to the sport, and left behind a legacy that would never be forgotten. In the end, all we have to say is, Blackjack Lanza was more than just a wrestler. He was a force of nature inside the ring, a tough competitor who never backed down, and a man who truly lived the hard-hitting wrestling life. He may not have been the biggest name in the business, but his impact was undeniable. He brought grit, realism, and intensity to the sport, earning the respect of fans and wrestlers alike. His partnership with Blackjack Mulligan created one of the most feared tag teams in history, and his work behind the scenes helped shape the next generation of wrestlers. Lanza may not have sought the spotlight, but those who know wrestling history understand his legacy. He was a wrestler's wrestler, tough, skilled, and always ready to fight. His induction into the WWE Hall of Fame was well-deserved, and while he may not have gotten all the credit he deserved during his career, true wrestling fans will always remember the Blackjacks and the intensity Lanza brought to the ring. His passing in 2021 marked the end of an era, but his influence will live on through the stories, the matches, and the legends told about him. Blackjack Lanza was a real one. No frills, no gimmicks, just a man who came to fight and left it all in the ring. Many longtime wrestling fans have shared their memories of watching Blackjack Lanza in action. One fan recalled seeing him live in the late 70s, saying they had never seen a wrestler bring so much aggression and realism into the ring. The way he moved, the way he sold every hit, it felt like a real fight, and the entire audience was hooked. There was something special about the way he carried himself, like he knew exactly how to command the crowd's attention without saying a word. Another fan who met Lanza after a show remembered his firm handshake, the kind that made you feel his strength instantly. He wasn't a man of many words, but you knew he was the real deal just by the way he looked at you. Even younger fans who have only seen his matches through old footage continue to be amazed by his style. One fan wrote about how watching Lanza was like seeing a master at work, someone who knew how to make every move look painful and real. In an era where wrestling has changed so much, it's easy to appreciate what Lanza brought to the sport. His career may have had ups and downs, but the respect he earned was timeless. He never chased fame or tried to remind people of his accomplishments. He simply did his job and remained a respected figure among those who truly knew the business. Finally, in 2006, Lanza received an honor that had been a long time coming. The Blackjacks were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, and it was a moment of recognition that many fans felt should have happened much earlier. He and Mulligan were finally given the respect they deserved as one of the greatest tag teams in wrestling history. The ceremony was a special moment, with wrestlers and fans celebrating their legacy. Even though this was an important honor, Lanza still didn't try to step back into the public eye. He continued to live a quiet life, staying connected to wrestling but never seeking attention. He had played his role, left his mark on the industry, and was content knowing that those who truly understood wrestling history recognized his impact. Even though he didn't always get the recognition he deserved, those who truly knew wrestling never forgot him. He was one of the toughest, most skilled wrestlers of his time. He had been a star in his era, a mentor to younger wrestlers, and a respected figure in the industry. His journey from a young wrestler trying to make a name for himself to a legendary figure in wrestling was something special. He had played his part, given everything he had to the sport, and left behind a legacy that would never be forgotten. And that's it for this deep dive into the career of Blackjack Lanza. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more wrestling history content. What do you think? Was Lanza underrated? Should he have been a bigger star? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep loving wrestling, past, present, and future. See you in the next one.
Yes, Jim, I'm looking to avenge my situation in Survivor Series. You know, the outcome of Survivor Series was one for the All-Americans, and that was a great thing. You see, Borga stands for all the things that we don't care about and we don't want to know.
With all due respect, Mr. Steiner, do you care responding to the allegations made by Giselle Shaw?
No comments.
Drew, straight to elevator. Excuse me, sorry.
Everyone talks about Scott. Big Papa Pump this, genetic freak that. But what about the other Steiner brother? The workhorse, the intensity machine. Rick Steiner was the heart of that team, but he was also a transphobic, racist, flawed man. Today we're discussing him for no right reasons. Rick Steiner is a name that wrestling fans know very well. He was a powerhouse in the ring, especially as one half of the Steiner brothers with his brother Scott. They were tough and intense and won championship after championship. But these days, Rick isn't making headlines for his wrestling. Instead, he's getting attention for all the wrong reasons, his controversial comments and social media activity. All right, let's get straight to it. Rick Steiner has been called out for making some seriously offensive remarks, and we're not talking about just one slip-up. At a wrestling convention in 2023, he reportedly went after wrestler Giselle Shaw, who is transgender, calling her a piece of trash and saying she didn't belong in the business. And this wasn't some behind-the-scenes whisper. It was loud, aggressive, and completely out of line. Witnesses confirmed how uncomfortable it was, and the backlash was immediate. And this isn't new for Rick. He's made multiple transphobic remarks online, using offensive language about transgender people and the LGBTQ+ community. The wrestling world has been pushing for more inclusivity, but Rick's comments have put him at odds with that movement. But it doesn't stop there. There have also been claims that Rick has made racist and xenophobic remarks. While there aren't as many well-documented incidents as with his transphobic comments, multiple people have come forward saying he's made inappropriate remarks about race and nationality. Whether or not these claims are fully proven, they only add to the perception that he holds outdated and harmful views. Now, before you become a keyboard warrior and type how I'm one big liberal son of a biscuit eater, I apologize. I'm extremely sorry for the bait. All these controversies, although big, are irrelevant to me. I just wanted to bring your focus to something bigger. Why did Rick Steiner not get the fame he deserved? Why is Scott Steiner the more famous of the two? The Steiner brothers were a legendary tag team, but Scott eventually outshined Rick. And honestly, there are some pretty clear reasons why. First off, Scott knew how to reinvent himself. He transformed into Big Papa Pump, a loud, arrogant, and completely OTT character. He had the look, the attitude, and the presence to make him a standout personality in the wrestling world. Fans either loved him or loved to hate him, but either way, they paid attention. Rick, on the other hand, stayed the same. He was always the tough, no-nonsense wrestler who let his in-ring skills do the talking. That's great for respect, but not necessarily for individual fame. Wrestling is as much about personality as it is about ability, and Scott figured out how to keep people entertained for years. Another huge factor, mic skills. Scott was pure gold on the microphone. His promos were wild, unpredictable, and full of energy. He had catchphrases, an intense delivery, and a way of keeping people glued to the screen just to hear what ridiculous thing he'd say next. Rick? Not so much. He was solid, but he didn't have that same larger-than-life presence when it came to talking. And in wrestling, talking is half the battle. Then there's championship success. While both brothers shined in tag team wrestling, Scott went on to win major singles championships, including the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. That took his fame to a whole new level. Rick had some singles success too, but it just didn't compare. Winning a world title cements a wrestler's place in history, and that's exactly what happened with Scott. And let's be honest, Scott had a level of charisma that Rick just didn't. Whether he was flexing his insane muscles, yelling about being a genetic freak, or throwing out crazy insults, he had a way of keeping people entertained. Rick was an incredible wrestler, but he didn't have that same over-the-top personality that made Scott stand out. Do you agree? Or do you think it's all about whose shoulder you're rubbing? Scott was pro at that, let me tell you. Now here's the interesting part. Both Rick and Scott have had their share of controversies. Scott has said plenty of outrageous things, but because of his larger-than-life persona, fans often brushed it off as part of his act. He built his career on being wild and unpredictable, so when he made a controversial statement, it felt like just another Big Papa Pump moment. But Rick, he doesn't have that excuse. His comments don't come off as part of a wrestling gimmick, they come off as personal beliefs, and that's why he's facing a much harsher backlash. Rick Steiner was an important part of wrestling history, and his skills in the ring were undeniable. But in recent years, his name has become more associated with controversy than his wrestling legacy. Meanwhile, Scott remains the more famous of the two, thanks to his ability to evolve, entertain, and stay relevant. Rick was a powerhouse in the ring, but Scott's charisma, promo skills, and championship wins made him the bigger star. While both brothers left a mark on wrestling, their careers and reputations have gone in very different directions. At the end of the day, wrestling is all about evolution. Some stars adapt and keep up with the times, while others get left behind. Scott moved forward. Rick, not so much. And that's why, for better or worse, their legacies have gone in such different directions. For such wrestlers who are left behind, I make these documentaries so fans can relive their prime. No matter how much people deny it, Rick is a legend. And for a legend like him here, I have a quick rundown of his epic career so you and I can relive his great days. Rick Steiner, whose real name is Robert Rex Steiner, was born on March 9, 1961. He is a retired American professional wrestler, best known for his time in World Championship Wrestling, or WCW. Fans loved his tough and intense style in the ring, and he became especially famous for teaming up with his younger brother, Scott Steiner. Together, they formed one of the most dominant tag teams in wrestling history, known as the Steiner Brothers. Before he became a professional wrestler, Rick was a talented amateur wrestler. He attended the University of Michigan, where he competed for the Wolverines and placed second at the Big Ten Championships in 1983. He also qualified for the NCAA tournament and even set a school record by pinning an opponent in just 15 seconds. After earning his bachelor's degree in education, he was introduced to professional wrestling by George "The Animal" Steele, a legendary wrestler himself. Rick decided to jump straight into the world of pro wrestling right after college, and he never looked back. In the early years of his wrestling career, Rick wrestled under his real name, Rob Rick Steiner, before changing it to Rick Steiner. He competed in different wrestling promotions, including the American Wrestling Association, International Wrestling in Montreal, and the Universal Wrestling Federation, or UWF. While in UWF, he teamed up with Sting, and the two of them won the UWF World Tag Team Championship in 1987. That same year, Rick also wrestled in Japan for New Japan Pro Wrestling. Then in 1988, UWF was bought by Jim Crockett Jr., who owned Jim Crockett Promotions, a major part of the National Wrestling Alliance. Rick, along with many other UWF wrestlers, was brought into Jim Crockett Promotions, which later became WCW. In early 1989, Rick's younger brother Scott started coming to the ring with him. Before long, they officially formed a tag team, the Steiner Brothers. They quickly proved they were a force to be reckoned with when they defeated the Freebirds to win their first World Tag Team Championship in November 1989. The Steiner Brothers dominated WCW's tag team division for years, winning multiple championships and also traveling to Japan to compete in New Japan Pro Wrestling, where they had great success as well. In December 1992, Rick and Scott made a big move by leaving WCW and joining its biggest rival, the World Wrestling Federation, or WWF. They made this decision after WCW's management, led by Bill Watts, offered them a disappointing contract extension. Watts also gave them the option to leave their current contracts early, which they took. In WWF, the Steiner Brothers continued to be one of the best tag teams around. They won the WWF World Tag Team Championship twice, both times by defeating the team of Money Inc., which consisted of Ted DiBiase and Irwin R. Shyster. Even though the Steiner Brothers were successful in WWF, they decided to leave in 1994. Rick later said that the reason for their departure was that Vince McMahon, the owner of WWF, didn't keep the promises he had made to them. Because of that, they felt it was best to move on. After leaving WWF, Rick Steiner jumped into Extreme Championship Wrestling ECW in April 1995. ECW was all about hardcore no-rules action, and Rick wasted no time making his presence felt. He stepped in for Sabu in a big main event match, and just like that, he was in the thick of it. But the real excitement came when he reunited with his brother Scott. The Steiner Brothers were back, and they picked up right where they left off. They won match after match, proving they were still one of the toughest teams out there. They even teamed up with Eddie Guerrero for a match, but came up short. Rick's time in ECW wasn't long, but it was definitely memorable. By the end of the year, he was ready to move on. Next stop, Japan. Rick and Scott took their talents to New Japan Pro Wrestling NJPW, where they thrived. They won the IWGP Tag Team Championship twice, proving their hard-hitting style worked anywhere. Wrestling in Japan was different, more focused on skill and technique, but Rick adapted fast. The Steiner Brothers wrestled full-time in NJPW throughout 1995 before making their way back to WCW in 1996. Even after that, Rick made occasional trips to Japan, including a big match in 2000 against Randy Savage. That match turned out to be Savage's last singles bout, making it a historic moment. In March 1996, the Steiner Brothers returned to WCW, making a big comeback on Nitro against the Road Warriors. They lost, but they showed they were still as tough as ever. They quickly got back in the mix, winning multiple tag team championships over the next few years. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. They were stripped of the titles at one point and had fierce rivalries with teams like the Outsiders. And then in 1998, everything changed. Scott turned on Rick and joined the NWO. It was a shocking betrayal. The brothers, who had always fought side by side, were now enemies. Rick tried to get revenge, but Scott always had the NWO backing him up. Then things got worse. Rick was attacked and suffered a shoulder injury, forcing him to take time off. But Rick wasn't the type to stay down for long. At Halloween Havoc 1998, Rick finally got his shot at Scott. It was a brutal match and Rick gave it everything he had. In the end, he won, proving he was still the tougher of the two. That same night, he also won the World Tag Team Championship with Buff Bagwell, though that partnership didn't last long since Bagwell later turned on him. But setbacks never kept Rick down for long. Over the next couple of years, Rick stayed busy in WCW. He teamed up with Kenny Chaos, had another heated feud with Scott, and even won the World Television Championship in 1999. He briefly reunited with the Varsity Club before taking a break in 2000. When he returned in 2001, he surprised everyone by turning against Kevin Nash and joining Scott's faction, the Magnificent Seven. He won the U.S. Heavyweight Championship, but lost it soon after. At WCW's final pay-per-view Greed, he lost to Booker T. And just weeks later, WCW was sold to WWF, marking the end of an era. Even after WCW shut down, Rick didn't stop wrestling. He competed in Japan and on the independent circuit, still bringing that same intensity to the ring. Every now and then, he and Scott would reunite for tag matches, reminding fans why they were one of the best teams ever. He never made a big return to WWE, but he remained a respected name in the wrestling world. His career was all about toughness, dedication, and never backing down. A true powerhouse, a tag team legend, and a wrestler who always gave the fans a show to remember. Rick Steiner made his debut for Total Nonstop Action Wrestling TNA on June 19, 2002, during the company's very first show. He took part in the 20-man gauntlet for the gold match to crown a new NWA World Heavyweight Champion, but the win went to Ken Shamrock. Rick didn't stick around long. He made a one-night return in October 2003, getting into a brawl with Jeff Jarrett. Then in 2006, he popped up again. On the May 4th episode of Impact, he was teased as a possible tag team partner for Sting at the upcoming Sacrifice pay-per-view. He showed up again on May 11th in a similar role, but nothing really came of it. In 2007, things got more interesting. Rick and Scott reunited at Sacrifice after Scott and Tomko lost a World Tag Team Championship match. The Steiners attacked Tomko, making it clear they were back in business. On the next episode of Impact, they stormed into Jim Cornette's office demanding a match against Team 3D for the tag titles. But that match never happened. Scott suffered a serious throat injury in Puerto Rico and had to have emergency surgery. Rick still showed up at Slammiversary teaming with Road Warrior Animal as Scott's replacement, but they lost to Team 3D. Rick wasn't done yet. At Victory Road, he interfered in the Match of Champions, stopping the referee when Brother Devin was about to pin Kurt Angle. A month later at Hard Justice, Scott finally returned from his injury, and the Steiners got their revenge. They defeated Team 3D and reignited their feud. But Team 3D struck back hard, attacking the Steiners and putting Rick through a table. The rivalry hit its peak in late September when the Steiners challenged Team 3D to a 2 out of 3 falls tables match at Bound for Glory. Team 3D won the first fall by slamming Rick through a table, but Scott evened things up with a Frankensteiner on Brother Ray. Then came the final fall. Scott lifted Brother Ray on his shoulders, and Rick hit his diving bulldog through a table, sealing the win. It was a huge moment for the Steiners. But just a few months later, on January 29, 2008, Rick was released from TNA due to budget cuts splitting the brothers up once again. Even after leaving TNA, Rick didn't stop wrestling. He kept going on the independent circuit, competing in different promotions. On August 9, 2008, he faced Bobby Eaton at Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, but came up short. In 2009, he teamed up with Scott again, and from 2010 to 2011, he continued wrestling for Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. In 2013, the Steiner brothers won the Preston City Wrestling Tag Team Championships, but lost them the very next day. Later that year, they defeated Eddie Kingston and Homicide at the House of Hardcore 2 event, proving they still had it. Rick kept wrestling here and there for a few more years. On November 5th, 2016, he competed in Great North Wrestling, challenging Devin Nicholson for the GNW Canadian Heavyweight Championship, but didn't win. Then in 2019, he made a surprise return to Japan. On September 19th, he teamed up with Kazushi Miyamoto in Tokyo Championship Wrestling and defeated Elliot Russell and Sigmund. That turned out to be Rick's final match. Then came a big moment in 2022. At NXT New Year's Evil, Rick made his first WWE appearance since 1994 to celebrate his son Braun Breaker winning the NXT Championship against Tommaso Ciampa. Just a few months later, on April 1st, 2022, Rick and Scott Steiner were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, cementing their legacy as one of the greatest tag teams of all time. But WWE had one last storyline twist for Rick. On the April 5th episode of NXT, after Braun retained his title, Rick was kidnapped by Joe Gacy and Harland. They locked him up inside a cage, adding a dramatic twist to his brief return. From ECW to Japan to TNA to WWE, Rick Steiner's career was full of twists, turns, and unforgettable moments. Whether teaming with Scott or going solo, he was always a powerhouse in the ring. His legacy as a tag team legend and a fierce competitor will never be.
Anyone who followed the wacky wars of the professional wrestling ring knew him well. Mad Dog Vachon, a snarling, bald, rule-breaking bad guy from Montreal who terrorized the mats of North America for more than 40 years.
Try as he may to be the kicking, scratching, biting mad dog, they just love him here in Minneapolis, and it seems to be sheer longevity.
Critics hated him. Parents were horrified. Wrestling purists lost their minds. Maurice Mad Dog was breaking all the rules, pushing every boundary. And honestly, that's why fans loved him. Maurice, the Mad Dog, is one fine dog no one has ever forgotten. He wasn't just another tough guy in the ring. He lived and breathed the wild. But his life outside the ring was just as dramatic, filled with personal struggles, tragedy, and moments that proved he was as tough as they come. The Mad Dog's wrestling style was raw and aggressive. He hit hard, fought rough, and made his opponents feel every punch, kick, and slam. Many wrestlers walked away from matches with him, nursing real injuries. I'm sure you remember him for biting, eye gouging, and breaking the rules whenever he could. To start with some of his most popular controversies, the Mad Dog was mad, literally, and he was so stiff the critics were afraid. You and I both know wrestling's always had a blurry line between what's real and what's not, right? But with Mad Dog, that line was practically invisible. He was so intense, so believable, that audiences genuinely questioned if what they were seeing was real. Critics were losing their minds, saying he was going way too far, especially with kids watching. All of this was way before the Attitude Era, before hardcore wrestling became what it is today. Maurice was pushing boundaries that nobody even knew existed yet. He was operating in a gray area, and that's what made him so compelling and so controversial. Take his feud with Vern Gone, for example. Gone was everything a champion was supposed to be, an all-American hero, technical, disciplined, and respected. Maurice, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He was unpredictable, aggressive, and willing to do whatever it took to win. Their styles clashed in the best way possible, creating some of the most legendary matches in AWA history. One of the biggest moments in this feud came on May 2nd, 1964, when Mad Dog shocked the world by defeating Gagne to win the AWA World Heavyweight Championship. This was a huge deal because Gagne had been the face of the company, the fan favorite, and Vachon took him down. If anyone thought it was a fluke, they were proven wrong just months later, when on October 20th, 1964, Vachon did it again, cementing his place as one of the top names in the business. But this rivalry wasn't just about championships, it was personal. Every match between these two felt like a fight for survival, and the fans ate it up. They knew that whenever Mad Dog and Gagne stepped into the ring, something big was about to happen. Then there was his feud with the Crusher. These two were big, tough, and known for their raw power. In 1969, the Vachon Brothers, Maurice and Paul, even teamed up to take on the Crusher and Dick the Bruiser for the AWA World Tag Team titles. That just shows you the level of competition Vachon was up against. And who could forget their brutal steel cage match at Comiskey Park in Chicago in 1970? Pure chaos. It was like a taste of the hardcore wrestling that would become huge later on. Wrestling is entertainment, sure, but Vachon challenged that. He made people question everything. He brought a level of realism, or at least the illusion of realism, to the ring that was unheard of. He wasn't just playing a character, he was the character. He lived it, breathed it, ate it for breakfast. And his life outside the ring was just as intense. He came from nothing. Born into a poor family in Montreal, he had to drop out of school to help out. That kind of upbringing, that struggle, it shapes you. It makes you tough. It made Vachon the man he was. Before wrestling, he was actually a competitive amateur wrestler. And get this, he was even disqualified from the 1950 British Empire Games for biting an opponent. Talk about intense. That just proves it. His aggression wasn't just an act. It was part of him. His personal life had its share of ups and downs. He was married multiple times, which hinted at some instability. But the biggest tragedy came when his third wife, Kathy Starr, was killed in a hit-and-run accident. Vachon and his daughter were also injured in the crash, making it one of the most devastating moments of his life. Fans saw him as an unstoppable force, but this showed that even the toughest men could be hit with heartbreak. There were also plenty of stories about his temper. While some of his aggression was part of his wrestling personality, many who knew him said he could be just as fiery in real life. However, separating fact from fiction in the wrestling world is never easy. Wrestlers often stayed in character even outside the ring, so it's hard to know how much of Vachon's reputation was real and how much was part of the show. Unlike many wrestlers of his era, Vachon didn't seem to struggle with substance abuse. Wrestling was a hard business, and many wrestlers turned to drugs and alcohol, but there's no real evidence that Vachon had those issues. His life was already full of enough struggles without adding that to the mix. Then came 1987, when his life changed forever. Vachon was hit by a car in a hit-and-run accident. The injuries were so bad that doctors had to amputate his right leg below the knee. It was a shocking moment, even for someone as tough as him. But instead of letting it break him, Vachon carried on, proving once again that he was a fighter in every sense of the word. After his wrestling career ended, he remained in the public eye. He became a well-loved figure, appearing at wrestling events and giving interviews where he reflected on his career. Despite the hardships he faced, he never lost his sharp wit and charm. Fans who had once feared him in the ring now admired him for his resilience and determination. Sadly, he passed away on November 21st in Omaha, Nebraska. He was 84 years old, and honestly, the guy lived a life. If you ever saw him wrestle, you'd know exactly what I mean. Pure intensity. The news came out, and while it was sad, it wasn't exactly a shock. 84 is a good run, especially for someone who lived as hard as Vachon did, both in and out of the ring. His family didn't go into a ton of specific medical details, which is totally understandable. They kept it private, and that's their right. The official word was natural causes. Now, natural causes is a pretty broad term, right? It basically means that age and the general wear and tear of life caught up with him. There wasn't one specific disease or sudden event that was pointed to as the cause. It was more of a gradual decline, which is pretty common as people get older. But let's be real, Vachon's wear and tear was probably a bit more intense than most folks. Think about it, decades in professional wrestling, and not just any wrestling, but the Mad Dog style. This guy was known for being absolutely brutal in the ring, biting, gouging, the whole 9 yards. That takes a toll on the body, no question. Vachon's legacy in wrestling continued long after he retired. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, an honor that solidified his place in wrestling history. Younger wrestlers often cited him as an inspiration, and his influence on the industry was undeniable. Whether it was his wild, unpredictable style or his ability to keep fans entertained, Vachon left a mark that would never fade. In the end, Maurice Mad Dog Vachon was one of wrestling's most unforgettable figures. He was wild, violent, and unpredictable in the ring, but outside of it, he was a man who faced real struggles, personal tragedy, and physical hardships. But these were just the controversies. What about his beginning? How did it all start? And how did he become so big? For the real fans out there, here is a rundown of his epic career. Maurice Vachon came into the world on September 14th, 1929, in Montreal, Canada, part of a big bustling family with 13 kids. His father, Ferdinand, was a no-nonsense police officer, and his mother, Marguerite, held everything together at home. Growing up in Villemar, a tough working-class neighborhood, Maurice learned early on that nothing in life came easy, but he was strong, scrappy, and full of fight. Wrestling wasn't just something he enjoyed. It was in his blood. As a boy, he'd squeeze into the crowd at the Montreal Forum, eyes locked on his hero, Yvon Robert. He wasn't just watching, he was studying. At 12 years old, he decided to stop dreaming and start doing, training at the YMCA under Frank Saxton, a coach with serious credentials. Maurice pushed himself harder than most kids his age. When he wasn't in the gym, he was hauling crates at the docks or working on the canal, building up his strength one grueling shift at a time. By 14, he wasn't just some kid with a dream. He was already one of Canada's top amateur wrestlers. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1948, at just 18 years old, he earned a spot at the Olympic Games in London. He stepped onto the mat and, in just 54 seconds, pinned the Indian champion. That kind of debut was impossible to ignore. He finished 7th overall, but the real victory came outside the ring. It was there that he met Verne Gagne, an American Greco-Roman wrestler who would become a key figure in his future. Maurice wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He kept pushing forward, and in 1950, at the British Empire Games in New Zealand, he brought home a gold medal. He was young, fierce, and hungry for more. For a while, he worked as a bouncer in Montreal, and let's just say, he wasn't the kind of guy you wanted to mess with. People started telling him he should take his talent into the world of professional wrestling. It made sense. He had the skill, the strength, and the attitude. So in 1951, he took the leap. His pro career started under Ontario promoter Larry Kasaboski, and it didn't take long for him to make waves. Winning a tournament in Sudbury, he snagged the North American Junior Heavyweight Championship. But success didn't come without setbacks. In Montreal, powerful promoter Eddie Quinn refused to book him, afraid Maurice might steal the spotlight from his top star, Yvon Robert. Instead of waiting for a break that might never come, Maurice hit the road, determined to make his own way. That road led him to Texas, where, in April 1955, he teamed up with Pierre LaSalle to win the NWA Texas Tag Team Championship. He was making a name for himself, but deep down, he knew something was missing. He needed an edge, something that would make him more than just another tough wrestler. He needed something that would make him unforgettable, and soon he would find it. Maurice was a skilled grappler, but he struggled to make himself stand out. So he took matters into his own hands. He bulked up to 225 pounds, shaved his head, and grew a menacing goatee. He also started buying local TV time before matches, boasting about his abilities and trash-talking his opponents. This kind of self-promotion was groundbreaking at the time, and it worked. Fans started paying attention. But what really cemented his persona was his in-ring style. He became an all-out brawler, biting, stomping, and pummeling his opponents with reckless abandon. His matches were wild, chaotic, and brutal. The turning point came in 1962, when Portland promoter Don Owen saw him unleash absolute mayhem in the ring. After Maurice started flipping over chairs, fighting outside the ring, and even knocking down a police officer who tried to stop him, Owen gave him the nickname Mad Dog, and it stuck. He was a true villain, known for using foreign objects, clawing at opponents with his sharpened fingernails, and delivering multiple pile drivers to finish off matches. His ruthless reputation even got him banned in 3 U.S. states. But despite playing the villain, fans couldn't get enough of him. His wild persona made him one of the biggest draws in wrestling. He also teamed up with his younger brother, Paul the Butcher Vachon, and together they became an unstoppable duo. On February 17, 1959, they won the NWA Canadian Tag Team titles, solidifying their place in wrestling history. Mad Dog was as wild outside the ring as he was inside it. He even met his future wife, Kathy Jo, during a wrestling event. But in true Mad Dog fashion, it wasn't a traditional love story. The rest was history. Maurice Mad Dog Vachon wasn't just a wrestler, he was a force of nature. From his humble beginnings in Montreal to becoming one of the most feared and beloved wrestlers in history, his story is one of grit, determination, and sheer passion for the sport. His influence on professional wrestling is undeniable. He helped shape what it meant to be a true heel, someone that fans love to hate. His promos, his larger-than-life personality, and his in-ring violence set a new standard for villains in the wrestling world. Over the years, he competed all over North America, making a lasting impact everywhere he went. His ability to rile up crowds and make them believe in his character was unmatched. He knew how to tell a story inside the ring, and that made every match feel important. Whether he was winning titles or making enemies, every time he stepped into the ring, fans knew they were in for a show. In the early 1960s, Maurice Mad Dog Vachon made his way to the American Wrestling Association, AWA, thanks to his old Olympic buddy, Vern Gagne. At that time, Gagne was not just the promoter of the Minnesota-based wrestling territory, but also its top champion. The two had a classic contrast. Gagne was the clean-cut, all-American hero, while Vachon was an uncontrollable, ruthless brawler. Fans absolutely despised Mad Dog, but that only made him more popular as a must-see villain. On May 2, 1964, in a moment that shocked everyone, Vachon defeated Gagne to capture the AWA World Heavyweight Championship. The victory didn't last long, as Gagne took back the title just 2 weeks later. But Mad Dog wasn't done. Later that same year, on October 20th, he once again bested Gagne in Minneapolis to reclaim the championship. Over the next 3 years, Vachon held the title 5 times, taking on some of the best in the business. Though his reign ended in 1967 when Gagne reclaimed the title, Vachon wasn't about to slow down. He briefly returned to his hometown of Montreal, winning the IWA International Heavyweight Championship twice while battling against Johnny Rougeau and Hans Schmidt. During this time, he also used his connections with hockey legend Jean Beliveau to secure a promotion license, much to the annoyance of rival promoters Johnny Rougeau and Bob Langevin. When Vachon returned to the AWA, he and his brother Paul Butcher Vachon became a dominant tag team. The Vachon Brothers shook up the wrestling world by defeating Crusher and Bruiser for the AWA World Tag Team titles on August 30th, 1969. The two teams later faced off in a brutal steel cage match at Comiskey Park in Chicago, where the Vachon once again emerged victorious. Their vicious battles paved the way for future hardcore wrestlers like Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher. One of the most unforgettable moments of Mad Dog's career happened on July 14th, 1973, in front of 29,127 fans at Montreal's Jerry Park, a record-breaking crowd for Quebec wrestling. In a dramatic twist, Vachon had promised to commit suicide if he lost to Killer Kowalski. When he won, the next day's newspaper headline read, "Vachon triumphs in front of 30,000 people and gives up on suicide." Fans loved his dramatic flair, and moments like these made him one of the most unforgettable characters in wrestling history. By the early 1970s, the Vachon family had taken over the AWA. While Maurice and Paul dominated the men's division, their sister, Vivienne Vachon, ruled the women's scene. In 1973, Mad Dog and Vivienne even appeared in the movie Wrestling Queen, further cementing their status as wrestling royalty. Though Mad Dog spent 2 decades as one of the most despised villains in the sport, fans started warming up to him in the late 1970s. Surprisingly, he teamed up with his former rival, Vern Gagne, to win the AWA World Tag Team titles in 1979. The odd pairing worked, and the duo held the titles for over a year before losing them to Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis. Vachon made a move to the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, in 1983. While his style didn't quite fit in with the Hulkamania era, he remained a regular in the Midwest and Quebec, even hosting a popular French-language interview segment, Le Brunch of Mad Dog. In 1985, he played a key role as Rick Martel's cornerman during Martel's AWA World Championship defense against Boris Zhukov. When Zhukov's manager, Chris Markov, tried to interfere, Mad Dog sprang into action, saving Martel from a double-team attack. In a steel cage rematch later that year, Vachon ensured Markov couldn't interfere by handcuffing him to himself. Vachon officially retired in 1986 with a farewell show in Montreal. After spending most of his career as a terrifying villain, he left the sport as one of its most beloved figures. His intense, wild persona influenced future stars like George the Animal Steele and Bruiser Brody, proving his legacy would live on. Vachon wasn't just a brute in the ring, he was a pioneer in how wrestlers connected with fans. He understood the power of television like few before him. He was the first wrestler to talk directly to the camera, which had never been done before, said filmmaker Yves Thériault, who directed a 2009 documentary about him. In Quebec, Vachon is considered one of the most influential wrestlers ever, alongside Yvon Robert. Wrestling historian Pat Laprade called him the best-known Quebec wrestler outside of Quebec and a legend. Author Greg Oliver ranked him as the fourth greatest Canadian wrestler, just behind icons like Killer Kowalski and Whipper Billy Watson. After hanging up his boots, Vachon settled in Carter Lake, Iowa, with his wife Kathy Jo. Tragedy struck in 1987 when he was hit by a car while out for a morning jog. The accident resulted in the amputation of his leg. The driver, a developmentally disabled man, was never charged and had no insurance. Despite the devastating injury, Vachon remained active, even appearing in beer commercials and working as a restaurant critic in Quebec. He made memorable appearances in the WWF, including one infamous moment at In Your House 7 in 1996. Sitting ringside, he watched in shock as Diesel ripped off his artificial leg and used it as a weapon against Shawn Michaels. He later appeared at Over the Edge in 1998 alongside his old rival, The Crusher. When Jerry Lawler tried to steal his artificial leg for laughs, the two veterans knocked Lawler out of the ring, proving they still had some fight left in them. Vachon was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2010, a well-deserved honor for a true wrestling legend. In 2018, he became the first inductee into the Nebraska Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, adding another accolade to his incredible career. From feared villain to beloved legend, Mad Dog Vachon left a lasting mark on professional wrestling. His wild, unchained persona inspired countless wrestlers, and his unforgettable moments, both inside and outside the ring, will never be forgotten by fans. Whether you loved him or hated him, one thing is certain: there will never be another Mad Dog Vachon. Mad Dog Vachon's career was nothing short of legendary. From his wild battles in the AWA to his intense rivalries with some of the greatest names in wrestling history, he carved out a legacy that still influences wrestlers today. His unpredictable, aggressive style made him one of the most feared heels in the business, and yet by the end of his career, he had won over the fans, turning into one of the sport's most beloved figures. He went from being one of the most hated villains in wrestling to someone fans respected and admired. His impact stretched far beyond the ring, inspiring future generations of wrestlers to embrace the power of character, intensity, and storytelling. Even after his retirement, his presence was still felt in the wrestling world, with tributes and acknowledgments from some of the biggest names in the industry. His induction into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2010 was a testament to his lasting influence on professional wrestling. His niece, Luna Vachon, carried on his legacy, and his influence could be seen in wrestlers like Bruiser Brody and George the Animal Steele, who adopted his wild and chaotic style. Even in his later years, Mad Dog remained a beloved figure, often making appearances at wrestling events and sharing his stories. Fans and wrestlers alike admired his dedication and passion for the sport. Despite the hardships he faced, including a tragic accident that led to the amputation of his leg, he never lost his spirit. He was a fighter both in and out of the ring, proving that his toughness wasn't just an act for the cameras, it was who he truly was. That's it for today's deep dive into the career of the legendary Mad Dog Vachon. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Mad Dog's story is one of resilience, passion, and sheer determination, qualities that make wrestling so special. What are your thoughts on Mad Dog's legacy? Do you have a favorite moment from his career? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts and stories. Until next time, stay tuned for more wrestling history and epic stories from the Squared Circle. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.